always like to give it a minute and let people in the audience say, "Does the sound work? Does the sound work?" Mm. Had a few where I forgot to turn on the sound. I was muted for like the first 20 minutes.
20 minutes? Oh my
Mm.
God. I did an evening program with a Unitarian church, and they didn't let me know that my slides weren't. So I went about 15 minutes before somebody said, none of your slides are moving. I say, what? You could have let me know 10 or 15 minutes ago.
I was like, oh, that's intentional. You're supposed to just imagine them. That's fine. All right, it looks like we're live. So, Michael, thanks for coming on and being willing to have a conversation with me. I really appreciate you taking the time to come on my show. Would you mind telling us a little bit about yourself before we get started?
Sure. Great. Thanks, Tom. I'm an eco-theologian. I've been called an evolutionary evangelist. Basically, I come from a science-based evidential perspective, but most of my work has been trying to help people get the evolutionary and ecological significance of religion, but not otherworldly religion. I'm a religious naturalist. So basically, my worldview in a nutshell is that reality is my God, evidence is my scripture. The history of the universe, the epic of evolution, is my creation story. Ecology is my theology. Integrity is my spiritual path, and by integrity, I mean the practices that help me live in right relationship to reality. So reality is my God, evidence is my scripture. The epic of evolution is my creation story. Ecology is my theology. Integrity is my spiritual path, and fostering accountability to the future is my mission. So that's sort of the essence of what I've been doing. Connie and I have been living on the road for the last 18 years. We actually celebrated our 19th wedding anniversary today. We've
Congratulations.
been living on the road. Yeah, thanks. We've been living on the road for 18 years. So we've spoken to close to 3,000 groups, literally atheists to evangelicals. And what we focus on is where science, inspiration, and sustainability intersect. So that's what we do. And I'm speaking to you from Eureka, California, which is we're staying in somebody's second home here for pretty much the most of the summer.
I remember that TV show Eureka from the sci-fi show. I really like that one.
Oh, I never saw that. I haven't watched television in close to 40 years. I have an addictive personality, so I gave up TV like in the mid 70s.
Probably a good idea. So, what is
Yeah, right.
religious naturalism? Why do you take the religious stance and apply it to naturalism as opposed to just calling it like science or just naturalism?
Yeah. By religious naturalist, I mean, I ground my sense of relationship because if religion's doing its job, it's to help us relate to reality. Science, if it's doing its job, is to help us to understand reality, and both are necessary. In fact, science-based cultures that don't have some element of society that ensures that the future is not compromised by the present can develop technology that actually becomes ecocidal. So I'm a religious naturalist in that my sense of religion has nothing to do with the otherworldly, nothing to do with supernatural. It's all about right relationship to reality, right relationship to the biosphere, the ecosphere, basically the soil, the forest, the water, the life upon which we depend. In all sustainable cultures for which we have evidence, all indigenous or cultures that didn't foul their own nest, basically, that lived in place without destroying the place, they all related to what we would call the ecosphere as if it were God, as if it was a greater thou, not a lesser it. So that's what I'm trying to do, but I'm trying to do it completely within a mainstream evidential understanding of physical evolution, biological evolution, and cultural evolution as our first and only globally produced evidence-based creation story.
Why call it a religion? Is because when people say religion, usually they associate that to beliefs of an afterlife, supernatural beings, souls, that kind of thing. Why not just
Yeah,
call it naturalism or science?
you can do that, and many people do. There are, I mean, Connie and I are both on the advisory board of the Religious Naturalist Association, RNA, and the Religious Naturalist Association, really the entire religious naturalist world, um, doesn't want to give up the word religion simply because anthropocentric, human-centered, city-based civilizations are actually thinking that religion is all about beliefism. So if I believe in spirits or entities or otherworldly this or that, then that's what religion is. And it turns out that there's a profound difference when you look at the whole history of of humanity as one story, you realize that the first 97 to 98% of our history, we lived more or less sustainably. That is, we lived more or less within the carrying capacity, that's the ecological term, the carrying capacity of the biosphere. And it was life ways. It wasn't called religion. It was called life ways. And life ways were what ensured that. So what I'm trying to do is basically say that religion has been asleep at the wheel, or worse, religion is basically cheerleading the psychopathic politicians that are driving us over the cliff. And that I'm about as I do everything I can to hit both theism and atheism, because it seems to me that the belief about whether God exists or whether God doesn't exist is precisely the distraction, because the biosphere is inescapably real. And yet, if we've been treating the biosphere as merely a source of resources for us and a place for our waste, then that's ecocidal. So I want to redeem the word religion, meaning that religion is about a healthy relationship to primary reality, the ecosphere. And that's what all of my work is about, basically.
You say you rail against atheists. Why would you rail against atheists, since it seems like your ideology would agree?
I don't rail against atheists. What I do is, to my mind, the theist versus atheist debate is a form of collective intelligence, a form of collective insanity, in that you've got people who are believing in an otherworldly being, they're theists. You got people who disbelieve in the existence of an otherworldly being, atheists, and yet the vast majority of theists and atheists treat the ecosphere as merely an it to be exploited rather than a thou to be honored and respected.
Yeah, I mean,
so
I think that would be
one of my most notorious sermons I preached at the largest cathedral in Oklahoma. And it was called Thank God for the New Atheists. Because I know all the new atheists, but Richard Dawkins actually wrote a chapter, I included in my book, Thank God for Evolution, a letter that he wrote to his 10-year-old daughter. At the time, she was 10. And my favorite criticism, Al Mohler, Newsweek magazine contacted Al Mohler, who's the president of Southern Baptist Theological College Seminary. And he's one of the go-to people when they want a fundamentalist to comment on something. And so he had to listen to my sermon. And he said, Michael Dowd gives even heresy a bad name. So I actually appreciate the fact that most atheists, humanists, free thinkers, skeptics, are relentless in their trashing otherworldlyism, their critique of supernaturalism and faith-based, believing in what old men and old books tell us, and that they keep coming back to an evidential worldview. It's just that in my experience, many atheists are still very much on or at least prior to COVID, still on the techno-optimist bandwagon that, like Steven Pinker, the whole myth of perpetual progress. And I think that is a myth from an ecological standpoint.
How so? Because I'm definitely on that bandwagon. And one of the comments Ben Roberts brought up is, why would it be bad to treat the Earth like a resource? Because I do think that, from my perspective, we are on a technological bandwagon, that we are going to continue to grow technologically, and that the only reason that we have to live within our means like we did in the past, like you mentioned, was because of our limitations. We didn't have the option to do otherwise. I see nature as more of an evil source, something that restricts us and binds us, not something that we should worship and live in cohesion with. I think it's something that we need to overcome.
Yeah, and that's the mindset that's pretty much got us to this place where I did a 24-minute video that I highly recommend to anybody watching or listening to this, and to you. It's called Sane versus Insane Progress. It's sort of my 24-minute Pinker takedown video, where I talk about how Steven Pinker and the other prophets of progress very accurately point out how things are getting better and better for a small subset of humanity. And Pinker's got 75 charts in his book. It's awesome. Philosophy of language was
better angels of our natures, right?
Well, that one too, yeah, but that was earlier. I'm talking about enlightenment now. But what he doesn't factor in is that every single system upon which we depend, the forest, the water, the climate, the soil, other species, the insects, and on, without exception, there's not a single system that we're dependent upon or that we rely on that isn't not just in decline, it's in precipitous freefall. And it's technological progress, quote unquote, and economic growth and development, quote unquote, that is progress and development that has actually caused that. And so it really needs to be called what it is. It's technological takeover and ecological self-destruction. So that's the piece where you and I would probably have the biggest difference in terms of, let me say it this way. Can you name for me any human-centered technology, that is any technology that benefits humans but doesn't benefit any other life form, that hasn't caused more problems over time? It just does it over time. You can start with the spear. You can start with fire.
Solar power?
Human-centered technology. Oh no, the green illusions. I mean, there's a book called Green Illusions by Ozzy Zahner, but then Michael Moore's recent movie, there's just so much that critiques this naive techno-optimism. Let's put it this way. Technology that humans create that doesn't integrate with life's technology, nature's technology, that is, it doesn't become food for other creatures at its end. Most of our technology becomes either inert or poisonous at its end. Any human technology that doesn't become food for other creatures at its end is going to always create more problems. It just does it over time. And that's what we're seeing now, the destruction of the ecosphere.
Well, doesn't nature automatically do that on its own? Like nature is going to kill everything anyway, from the decay of the sun, from the heat death of the universe. So it seems like what we're doing is simply trying to mitigate that. Not, even though our technology does in fact can cause some level of death, it doesn't cause nearly as much as nature's going to cause at the end. We're just simply trying to assuage the damage nature is causing away from us as much as possible.
Yeah, that's an interesting perspective. Yeah, if you take a look at over billions of years, if you compare billions of years to hundreds of years, which is an unfair comparison, sure, ultimately, the sun's going to go super, or, red giant, and, the heat death of the universe. I mean, sure, everything, death.
Well, we don't have to go with the billions of years. We can just go hundreds of years, say tsunamis, hurricanes, tornadoes, volcanoes, cancer, death, heart disease, everything, hunger, malnutrition, lack of water, bacteria.
Yeah. Well, there's a fundamental principle. See, ecology really is my theology. And the two most important books I've ever read on that are this one, William Catton's book, Overshoot, The Ecological Basis of Revolutionary Change. Many of us consider this the most important book of the 20th century, and certainly the most important one I've ever read. And then Teddy Goldsmith, The Way, An Ecological Worldview. He was the publisher and the editor of The Ecologist magazine for close to 40 years. And the fundamental concept is that we must live within the limits, the constraints of the living world. So we can only take so much and exude so much waste before the system starts to break down. So that's basically the essence of genuine sustainability, not all this faux sustainability, this deceptive sustainability, like sustaining technological industrial capitalism. But essentially, we need to live within the carrying capacity of the living world for us to have a future. And we've rapidly overshot those carrying capacity limits. And now we're about to we are entering into what I would call the age of consequences as a result.
Oh yeah, I totally agree. I think we definitely need to limit our use of technology and resources so that we don't overburden the planet, because then we're all going to die. But I don't think that is in and of itself a good thing. I think that if we had the ability to essentially unify our brains with computers or whatever, and we no longer needed to rely on the resources of the planet, then we could just leave behind everything, all of those living in cohesion with nature. We can just go away with that and don't have to care anymore. So I don't think the living in cohesion with nature is in and of itself a good thing. I think it's just a necessary evil that we have to sustain, because if we don't, we're going to die.
You and I have different ways of languaging that. I don't know that we ultimately have a huge difference in terms of final outcome, but how we get there and how we language it sounds to me quite different, quite different. To my mind, nature is a secular way of saying primary reality. That is, everything we depend upon. There's a fundamental image that I think if you don't have this image, it's difficult to have an accurate worldview. And that's the image of nesting dolls, that we live within systems within systems within systems. And each system has its own integrity, its own self-organizing nature that evolved over millions and billions of years. And so the biosphere, for example, is a system. And if we violate the integrity of the ecosphere, that is, if we do transportation, economics, politics, if we do all the things that get us food, that allow us to live and travel and move and whatever, in ways that violate the laws, the way of, again, the way of life, then we are, whether you call it good or bad or evil or whatever, but we're self-destructive. We need to look at the living world as a greater that we need to respect, or at least let's put it this way: we don't have any evidence of sustainable cultures or non-self-destructive cultures that didn't do that. So it's a matter of, but we're not going to do it in time. So make no mistake, we're going to hit the wall. We're rapidly we're already several decades into what John Michael Greer calls catabolic collapse. That is where we've overextended what we can afford to maintain, and now we're feeding on ourselves. And there are preconditions. There's we know of over 100 city-based civilizations in the last 7,000, 6,000 years that went through the boom and bust cycle. In fact, Luke Kemp wrote a thing in the BBC last year, February 19th, I think it was, called "Are we on the path to civilizational collapse?" And of course, he answered yes. And he has a chart that shows 88 civilizations just between 3000 BCE and 1000 of the Common Era. So he doesn't go back before 5,000 years ago. He doesn't go back before 3000 BCE, and he doesn't go look at the last 1,000 years. And he's got 88 civilizations, how long they lasted, what they died from, and stuff like that. And most of them, the overextending, carrying, basically overshoot is why most of them, some climate change, some war, some taken over, some lost a trading partner. There's a number of reasons, but ultimately the triggers that finally did in a society or a culture or civilization couldn't have done what they did without the preconditions of usually ecological overshoot, usually a degradation of resources, basically using, we didn't have the only form of energy before fossil fuels was trees, essentially, and human and animal muscle power. And so once you wiped out all the trees and and the soil washed out, then you had to go take over other places that were, at least economically affordable to do so. And then ultimately, when it's too expensive, then your civilization contracts and collapses. So I'm hoping that we can learn from that to the degree that as industrialism continues the process of contraction and collapse, that if there are any humans that survive this bottleneck, and that's an open question. Whether we go extinct in 2 million years or whether we go extinct in 20 years, it's probably going to be in that window. And then life goes on. Species come and go. The earth turns, continents, glaciers come and go. We'll see all of that. And but I'm hoping that there'll be pockets of humanity that survive this bottleneck, and that then come home to reality, come home to right relationship to the living world as a greater thou, not a lesser it.
So do you think
that's what wakes me up excited?
Oh yeah, for sure. So do you think that since we have passed that bottleneck and we are heading towards a crevasse in human history, do you think that investing in technology as much as we can to try and find a way to mitigate that is a good thing, or should we just avoid that? And
actually, it's difficult for me to answer just in sort of a flat way on that, because there's no such thing as technology in the singular. There are multiplicities of technologies. Some of them help us pay attention at scale and at speed that our primate brains don't do. And so there are forms of technology that are profoundly useful and helpful and can help us to actually decrease our impact on the living world. And pay attention to how well we're doing. It seems to me that the fundamental, like I've been working with this idea for a while now, the fundamental thing that marks the difference between cultures that are on a self-destructive path, an ecocidal path, and those that can sustain until something takes them out, are those that how they measure progress. If progress and well-being are measured in life-centered terms, ecocentric ways. So if your society or culture measures well-being and success and progress in terms of how well is the soil doing decade by decade, how well are the forests doing decade by decade, what are the other species doing decade by decade, and now what's the climate doing decade by decade, et cetera, then there's at least a potential for some form of genuine sustainability. To the degree that we measure progress and well-being in human-centered terms, either individuals' wealth or corporate wealth or nation states or whatever, then we tend to treat everything we depend upon, which is ultimately fundamentally from a long-term perspective more important than us, but we tend to treat it merely as resources and a place for our waste. And that has proven itself scores of times to be unsustainable, self-destructive.
So are you saying that if a society measures its success based off of the success of the environment at the cost of humans, should we prioritize the environment over humans and sacrifice human lives?
Absolutely, no question about it. I mean, it's not a matter of prioritizing. I don't want to fall into the idolatry of human agency. I think things are out of our hands. I think we're already 25 years into not just climate change, but abrupt climate change, where you got like 10,000 years of climate change in a human lifetime or a half a human lifetime. That seems to me, as best I read the evidence, that's been ongoing since the late 80s, mid to late 80s. We're now in an abrupt climate change era. Anybody who doubts that, the two people who probably popularize this perspective most effectively are Paul Beckwith, who does these videos on abrupt climate change. He's a Canadian. He's actually a really serious chess master. You ought to connect with him. I know you like chess. But also Nick Humphrey, meteorologist Nick Humphrey. And if you just listen to any interviews or read or watch any of the videos of meteorologist Nick Humphrey or Paul Beckwith, you'll see that we don't have to try to trim human population. Nature's going to do that for us in a really elegant way this century. In fact, it's not outside the realm of possibility that 2019, if we have 80 million or more people that die this year or aren't born this year, now this could possibly be the first year where human population hasn't grown in quite a lot of ways because of COVID and the economic impacts of COVID. So I think nature's going to trim our population. It's inconceivable to me that there won't be less than a half a billion people 50 years from now. If any humans exist, it'll be less than a half a billion 50 years from now, just through war, drought, famine, and living in a post-antibiotic age, it seems to me.
I don't think
it's not about choosing.
I'm not that pessimistic. I don't think that 6.5 billion people are going to die. I think it's probably going to level off at the 7 to 8 billion mark. That'd be my guess. But why do you think
that's a faith claim? That's a faith claim. There's no evidence behind that. Prior to the discovery of fossil fuels, there was never more than a half a billion people. That's a scientific fact. So without that dense concentrated energy, I mean, we use 9 calories of energy to get 1 calorie of food. This is not sustainable. So that's allowed our population to just skyrocket. But once that goes bye-bye, which it's pretty rapidly doing, we're already into peak. We're already past what's it called? Oil, not alternative oil, there's a term I'm blanking. At any rate,
fossil fuels?
we're but there's a term that's escaping me. But in any event, we're already into the dirtier, harder to get, much more expensive, and far less energy return on energy invested. 100 years ago, for every one unit of energy that you put into it, you get 100 back. Now we're down into the 15 to 18 range. So human population, to say that it'll level off at 7 billion or 6 billion or 5 billion, that's fine if you want to make that claim as a faith claim, but we have no evidence to support that. No evidence that human beings, more than a half a billion humans, can survive without fossil fuels.
Peak oil, is that what you're looking for?
Yeah. Peak oil is the understanding that long before we run out of oil, there's plenty of oil, plenty of natural gas, we'll run out of affordable. I mean, we're already beginning to see some pretty, peak oil is a whole movement. We're into that's unconventional. So we're already peak conventional oil. That peaked and sort of plateaued around 2005 or 6 and sort of been a rough, bumpy plateau. The only thing that's temporarily kept us going is shale oil, which has never been economically affordable. And so basically you've got a situation where it's never paid for itself. It's kind of like nuclear. From the 1950s to the 1980s, we had a expectation that even peak oil, even peak petroleum, peak coal, all that stuff, we'd be able to power ourselves indefinitely with nuclear. Well, it turns out, in fact, Catton's overshoot was kind of the nail in that coffin. is that you've got a situation where if we had cheap energy, if we had free energy, if we had, we would just commit ourselves all the more to ecological overshoot. We would use resources and produce waste and basically destroy the living world in the attempt to have human progress, not realizing that we have to treat the biosphere first.
Well, there's a few things there. First thing is that it seems to me like shale and fracking oil has actually paid for itself. I mean, with new technology, we found cheaper ways to produce it, and it has actually become profitable, which is why so many companies are doing it. And the nuclear power does seem to be like a viable option. I don't see the only reason we don't do it is because people don't like it; they're afraid of it. But it is a viable option, and a more important option.
It's never paid for itself. There's never nuclear power does not pay for itself. It only has existed because of massive government subsidies. So even without the fear of contamination and the long-term, Fukushima and all that stuff, you've got a situation where without the incentives, the financial, not just incentives, but the financial subsidy dumpster, nuclear has never paid for itself. And shale, oh my God, look into shale oil. Shale oil is a Ponzi scheme. No, there have been a few shale oil companies that have made any money in the last decade. It's totally existed on debt. Debt is the only thing that has kept it going. It's James Howard Kunstler and John Michael Greer and Richard Heinberg are people who write extensively on that. But anyway, you didn't want to have a conversation. This is going to be on religious naturalism. So let's cycle back to sort of what the theme of your series is.
Well, I did want to mention one other thing, which is fusion and fission energy, because they are developing that with the tokamak and some other new generators, which are going to be pretty energy positive, which is going to have a pretty big impact on our energy consumption if they work.
Fusion energy tends to always be 30 to 40 years out. That's the promise. And I think that we will never see economically viable fusion energy at any kind of scale.
I think they're actually building two right now, that are actually meant exactly for that purpose. But anyway, yeah. So
I have no need to debate you on any of this, but my worldview is profoundly eco-theological. That is, I believe the ecos is our biophysical creator, sustainer, and end. And we will either treat the ecosphere as a greater thou, or we will go extinct. But that's my worldview.
Yeah, and mine is more the opposite. I think that nature is.
Yeah, you're just more sort of techno optimist or techno control.
I a little differently than that. I would say that I think nature is the enemy that we need to overcome. I think nature is the greatest evil, not the good that we should be trying to live in harmony with. We live in harmony with it out of necessity, but I don't think it's something we should look for. I think we should try to overcome nature. Nature is the greatest enemy in my perspective.
Yeah, not my worldview. So you're entitled to it, of course, but I don't need to convert you or convince you either.
So what do you use religious naturalism to build communities of atheists around the country? Is that a big thing that religious naturalists do?
No, not really. I mean, basically, in every Braun Taylor wrote a book. He's a philosopher and environmental writer. He's the director of the first PhD program in the United States on religion and ecology at the University of Florida, Gainesville. And he wrote a book called Dark Green Religion, where he took a look at earth honoring, nature honoring elements within all the secular and religious settings, from the earth firsters to various green forms. I wear, when I speak publicly, I wear a green clergy shirt because I'm committed to the greening of religion. It's just a symbol, but there are evidence honoring, again, coming back to sort of my sort of creed, my eco-theo creed. Reality is my God, evidence is my scripture, big history is my creation story, ecology is my theology, integrity is my spirituality, and fostering accountability to the future is my mission. Those 6 principles unite tens of millions of secular and religious people around the world. But atheists, like, for example, people who are phobic of God talk, understandably, given how otherworldly it's been used in recent centuries or decades, they don't talk about the God talk. So they'd say reality is my ultimate commitment. Evidence is the way reality reveals itself, and so forth. But there are not enough pockets. I mean, yes, I've spoken to half the Unitarian Universalist denomination. So there's about 1,000 Unitarian Universalist churches and fellowships. I've been in the pulpit of about half of them, about 500. And I would say the vast majority of Unitarian Universalists are religious naturalists. They don't have otherworldly or supernatural beliefs. Some of them come out of Judaism or out of Christianity or out of Islam or whatever. They find, to varying degree, religious or spiritual language can be helpful if it's not interpreted too literally or otherworldly, but they're very much grounded in an evidential understanding of reality. And they tend to be very committed to peace and justice and have and other kinds of trying to better society. So in that sense, yeah, I speak to Unitarian Universalist congregations all over the continent and have for 18 years, but also liberal Christian, quote unquote, progressive Christian churches and sort of the more science-oriented New Thought, New Age. I speak there, but I've also spoken dozens and dozens of times in just groups of humanists, atheists, freethinkers, skeptics. I mean, Michael Shermer is a friend of mine, Skeptic Society. He had me speak to a group of 350 humanists and atheists down at Caltech about 10 years ago. So it's not so much creating congregations of atheists, it's creating it's sort of doing what I do to help people have an understanding of evidence and an evidential worldview and a sense of, whether they use the word sacred or not, a sense of respect and healthy relationship to the living world upon which we depend.
From my perspective, the reason I don't like religious language is because it has a connotation of being dogmatic. Like if we take evidentialism and say it's sacred, that means it's like unquestionable or something like that. And that is something that I see as anti-science, because science is, there should be no authorities. There should be nothing that's unquestionable. There should be nothing is sacred, kind of a worldview. And that's why I think the religious language is really hard for me to adopt, because of that dogmatic
yeah, you don't need to. Nobody needs to. And your point is a really important, well taken one, which is, yeah, once you throw the term holy or sacred or whatever onto something, it tends to imbue that with an authority that can become rather quickly counterproductive. So I agree with you there. I just treat, for me, something is sacred if it can't be bought or sold. So once something enters the marketplace, then it's no longer treated as more important than individuals or groups. And then in the history of humanity, there's not one example of, hundreds of cultures and over 100 civilizations that we know of. There's never been a market economy that didn't self-destruct, period. No exceptions. Because market economies treat primary reality, the soil, forest, water, life upon which we depend, merely as resources and a place for waste, and that's never sustainable. So that's when I mean sacred, I mean it can't be bought or sold. It's valued for what it contributes to the community. But yes, if you start calling science or evidence sacred, then you run into, to my mind, what science is all about is reflecting humanity's global collective intelligence. So you've got Christian scientists, Buddhist scientists, Hindu scientists, atheist scientists, scientists of all religious tradition and no religious tradition, that are all contributing collectively to our best understanding of how things are and which things matter. And that's fundamentally what every society needs to deal with, how things are and which things matter.
What would be the alternative to a market economy?
Well, what you typically have between city-based civilizations, which is some form of feudalism, some form of barbarism, some form of an exchange. It's almost always small scale, and it's almost always it deals with reciprocity. It deals with, Confucius was famously asked by one of his students, can you sum up your, the essence of your worldview in the most concise way? And he said, I can do it with one word: reciprocity. So in reciprocal cultures where there's an exchange of goods and services, but there's a sense of obligation, there's a sense of indebtedness. Just yesterday, we have a family meeting. My family, I've got 3 kids. My oldest daughter is in Texas. She's 37. My son, who's 35, is just got married. He's in Colombia, South America. And then my youngest daughter just had a baby. She's in Ann Arbor, Ypsilanti, Michigan. So they and their spouses, and Allison, my first wife, and Connie and I, and her husband, we all get on a Zoom call. And I just heard a story yesterday about how this, that essentially there was a guy who I'm going to butcher up the details, but essentially he was in his teenage years. He needed, at the age of 21, he needed to do something for the society, and so people helped out. And he asked all the different people in the village. This is in South America somewhere. All the people in the village, and they helped him out. And then years later, when he made a lot of money, came back to North America, he tried to go, and they were like, they were offended is not even strong enough. They were like, "What the? Are you crazy?" It's the sense of indebtedness, the sense of mutuality that you find in non-market-based economies, where you know that somebody's going to be looking after you and helping you out because you've been doing that too. That sense of reciprocity that you find. So, anyway, I'm not an economist, but I would say, you've heard me say John Michael Greer quite a bit. He's one of my favorite authors. I think I've read 15 of his books in the last 7 years, and I've recorded about 9 of them. One of my favorites is called The Wealth of Nature, Economics as If Survival Mattered.
A play on the wealth
and
of nations.
It's basically, yeah, exactly, the wealth of nature, economics as if survival mattered. And it's basically taking the principles of ecology and saying we must mimic the wisdom of ecological reality in terms of how we exchange goods and services for there to be any sense of an economics that's sustainable. It's a brilliant book. One of the best books on ecological economics that's out there.
Sully asked, do you have a position on the labor theory of value? Would you agree or disagree with that? Or
I don't know. Economics is not my thing.
So when you say a sense of indebtedness, do you mean like getting rid of money as an intermediary and just going based off of?
I'm not qualified to talk on the issue of economics. I'd be just talking out my ass. I wouldn't know what I'm doing. I'd get into silly things because I'm just, know more, and your people who watch this are going to know more than me on economics.
Yeah, because I'm trying to.
If you want to talk about sustainability, if you want to talk about progress, if you want to talk about eco-theology, if you want to talk about any of that stuff, I'm happy to share, because I've spent many, many, many years studying this stuff. Just for the last 7 years, for example, I've studied probably 20 to 30 hours a week. I've studied the rise and fall of civilizations and how civilizations consistently contract and collapse, and what leads to what forms of religion are detrimental. Religion, or life ways in healthy cultures, religion plays the role of ensuring that the future is not compromised by the present. So the idea that we should invite the 7th generation in our imaginations to be present in terms of our decisions today, that's not just a good idea. To do otherwise is evil. Cultures that consistently act in the present in ways that diminish and destroy the future are considered evil by those future generations. And so religion played that role in healthy societies. That's what not just Teddy Goldsmith's book, The Way, but he wrote an entire book just on this topic. It's called The Stable Society. And what he did was he took a look at our best anthropological evidence over about 500 years of the difference between cultures that foul their own nest and cultures that don't. And basically the role of lifeways. He said he defined religion as the control mechanism of stable, sustainable cultures. And by mechanism, he simply meant that aspect of society that spoke with moral authority, that we will not compromise the future, that basically we are accountable to the future. In unsustainable cultures, religion downgrades to being merely a coping mechanism, because in the last 3,000 years, for example, when all of the great religions that we now see around us, Hinduism, Buddhism, Shintoism, Taoism, Confucian, Christianity, Islam, whatever, they all emerged in cultures that were already unsustainable. So they couldn't, in any actual sense, limit the economic and political reality. In some cases, they had been taken over by the political elites. And so religion, in that sense, in the last 2,000 or 3,000 years, has really downshifted to being a coping mechanism. Religion kind of helps us cope with living in a self-destructive culture, and have a good life and die a relatively peaceful death, and leave a sweet legacy in the midst of a self-destructive culture.
What did you say religion was before it was just a coping mechanism? It was like a way to...
control mechanism in healthy cultures, a coping mechanism in unsustainable cultures.
What's the difference between those two? Because from my perspective, a coping mechanism is kind of a control mechanism.
Well, no. Okay. Again, thinking nesting dolls. If your religion emerges in a culture where you can't in any meaningful way limit the political and economic establishment, that you can't limit that so that they don't act self-destructively, then no, you're not controlling. It's the control mechanism simply means there needs to be in health, and there always has been in healthy, sustainable cultures, there's some element of society, whether you call it religion or life ways, that ensures upon accountability to the future, but also accountability to the past. See, that's the thing. In individualistic cultures, where we think of ourselves as isolated individuals rather than part of these larger systems, you've got a situation where the ancients didn't believe in spirits. They related personally to the river, the ocean, the water, the other animals. So it's having a personal, that is a respectful relationship with everything you depend upon seems to be, we call it animism, but that's simply a name, a label that Western anthropology put on this relating in a respectful way with everything you depend upon. And when we don't do that, when we relate to what we depend upon as merely resources, we tend to go into overshoot. We tend to cut down too many trees, use too much topsoil, wipe out the megafauna and so forth, and then have to deal with the consequences. And in some cases, that means after we wipe out all the megafauna, we realize, oh shit, and so we learn to become indigenous. That is, many societies learned to live more or less respectfully and more or less in a mutually enhancing relationship with primary reality, but they did so only after they already overshot and then have to suffer the consequences.
So by accountable to the future and past, would that include like heaven and hell kind of a thing, where you're accountable for your past?
Oh my God, no. Well, no. Except mythically, I mean, we're creating hell. It's nothing otherworldly. I mean, we're creating.
Oh yeah. I mean, I don't
situation.
Mean like, do they actually exist?
Oh,
I mean,
okay,
like,
yeah.
Does the idea of a thing make us accountable?
What I'm meaning is that what a lot of people don't realize is that our Western fear of death is not universal. It's not held in the vast majority. There are exceptions, but the vast majority of indigenous societies that still exist on the periphery, we have no evidence that they feared death because they knew that when they died, they became an ancestor. In other words, they weren't forgotten. They weren't lost. When you died, you became a revered ancestor, and you were in the imagination of the culture. You were consulted in terms of how to live sustainably. So in cultures that don't foul their own nest, it's like the opposite of the telephone game, where it gets distorted. Basically, you pass on the wisdom of what's been handed down to you, and it's often been interpreted or held in mythic stories, because that's what in oral cultures, that's what we remember is stories that have personification. Basically, that's the key thing, is personification. So holding on to the wisdom that's been passed to you and then passing that wisdom faithfully to your children and grandchildren, that's the essence of how to live in a more or less sustainable way. And so that sense of honoring the ancestors, Western anthropology calls it ancestor worship. It's not ancestor worship. It's honoring what the frick they told us, and then passing that on faithfully to your children and grandchildren through ritual and rites of passage and all that kind of stuff. So that's what I'm meaning. It's nothing otherworldly, nothing heaven and hell, although those in literate cultures, in the cultures of the last several thousand years where we start having literacy that escapes the priesthood and then becomes commonplace, you do see these other sort of otherworldly, whether it's karma in the East or heaven and hell in the West, you find these often otherworldly, certainly otherworldly if you interpret it literally, mechanisms that attempt to control people. So you're right in that sense. They attempt to create behavior. So if you believe that there's going to be an eternal reward and you genuinely believe it, or if you believe there's going to be eternal damnation, punishment, there's a pretty decent chance that you're going to live your life in a somewhat different way than if you didn't have those beliefs. So the practical truth is not factual truth. And the same thing is if you believe in these karmic, reincarnation again and again, that's what a lot of people don't realize, is that beliefs are not for mapping reality. Beliefs are for molding behavior. So it's what David Sloan Wilson, probably the leading evolutionary theorist alive today. He and Ed Wilson and Richard Dawkins are probably the three most significant evolutionary theorists. And David Sloan Wilson has this profound distinction, really useful, between practical truth and factual truth.
Is that kind of like
Practical
Jordan
truth,
Peterson's metaphorical truth versus, I forget what he called the other one, the actual truth?
it may be. I've not read Peterson enough to know. It may be. But practical truth is, if you act as if it's true, you'll experience personal wholeness, social coherence, and ecological integrity. Those are the three things that every culture needs to deal with: personal wholeness, social coherence, and ecological integrity. So if you have a belief that helps you do that effectively and helps your society do that, then that's practical truth. It's completely mythic in most cases. But factual truth is what science deals with. Science gives us an increasingly accurate understanding of the nature of reality. But if factual truth is not also interpreted in a way that's practically true, then we simply create technologies that destroy, diminish, or destroy everything we depend upon, and then ultimately it's ecocidal. So it's not about just knowing factual truth. It's also about interpreting the knowledge in ways that help us live in a way that's a blessing to future generations rather than a curse to future generations.
That leads up to a question. Ivo Andre asked, what would be your suggestions to stop or minimize the self-destructive process?
I don't think at this point it can be done. I mean, it can be done individually. We can all make, John Michael Greer calls it using less. We can all adapt to less, L-E-S-S, less energy, less stuff, and less stimulation. We can all do that, and it benefits our lives, and we feel better about ourselves. And, there's a whole range of practical things that we can do as individuals and small communities that can actually be a contribution, but we are part of a larger global industrial capitalist system that has its own energy, its own dynamic, it's a self-organizing, emergent thing that we don't have control over anymore. It's on its own. It will run into its own limits of the living world, and then when the rubble stops bouncing, we'll see what emerges out of that. But I don't think we can mitigate abrupt climate change. I don't think we can mitigate any longer the sixth great extinction. The only question is, will we be on the list? And there's a decent chance that we will be, unfortunately. But that doesn't mean we can't have a kick-butt great life for the coming weeks, months, years, and if we're graced to have decades still, we can have a super high-quality life. In fact, that's the major project of my life this year, 2020, are my post-doom conversations. If people just go to postdoom.com, you'll see I've got like 50 conversations, post-doom conversations, where I'm talking to people who get the big picture, who get all the big scary stuff, who've moved through whatever grief they've needed to move through, and are inspiring in their local engagement and the work they do. I mean, it's really post-doom. It's beyond the freak out, beyond the depression, beyond the overwhelm. And then how do we stay inspired and help others be inspired to do whatever we can do at whatever scale we can do it, and not try to not worry about or freak out about the systems that are already out of our control.
Sully asked a question on that. Have you seen the TV show Dune at all? Probably that. You said you haven't seen TV in like 40 years. We asked what your thought was on the ecological themes of that show, because it has a similar kind of...
I haven't seen it, but what's it called?
Dune, the sci-fi series Dune, because they have a similar ecological theory that you're proposing.
Oh, yeah, I know about it, but I've never seen it, and I've never read any of the novels, and I haven't watched it, so no. But yeah, there's some, I mean, even though I don't watch television, that's largely because I broke both of my legs. I'm 61 now, and I broke both of my legs when I was a teenager, and I got addicted to soap operas as well as to Percodan, and I just was watching these soap operas, and I'm thinking, what a friggin' waste of time. And so I stopped watching TV in like 1975. And I think if I've watched 2 programs a year since then, it's a lot. I just don't watch television. And but there's a lot of good stuff. One of the things that we did just 2 weeks ago was we watched the series Will Smith, This One Strange Rock, I think it was titled, about Earth and these astronauts and stuff. Mm-hmm. We loved it. We absolutely loved it.
Another question they had about Justin Maurer asked, what do you think about the morality of human reproduction? Do you think that having kids, more than a certain number of kids, is immoral because of if it overextends our means? And then we should cut back on like
Well,
number of
there's
kids?
no, yeah, it's a totally legitimate question. There's no question that human population exacerbates every single other problem. And we have 7.8 billion human beings on the planet. The carrying capacity for humans without fossil fuels is less than a half a billion. And so, yeah, bringing more kids into the world is just going to create a greater burden on society. However, what also doesn't usually get factored in is that the richest 10%, the richest 20% of humanity are the ones that do the vast amount of ecological damage. So for every one industrial human that either doesn't reproduce or that significantly downshifts using less energy, less stuff, less stimulation, that's going to be, offset. But it's kind of hard for me to talk about reasonably because I just had a granddaughter that was born a month ago, and so
Little biased.
and I honestly had serious fear about her when she got married 2 years ago. Miriam, my youngest daughter, when she got married 2 years ago, I was terrified of the thought that they would have a baby, partly because of simply the moral or ethical issue, but largely because I think this is a very scary, dangerous time to bring a child into the world. And then I had this wave of trust that flooded over me a year ago, where I thought to myself, okay, worst case scenario is our species goes extinct in the next 30 to 40 years. Would I want my daughter to not, the last generation, to have a mother-child bond? Would I want her to not have that experience? No. And so I called her up and I was in tears and I said, I trust whatever is going to happen. And she ended up having a baby. So now I'm a grandpa again, and I'm hugely grateful. And as I said earlier, we are going to see this is the thing, we've seen it dozens of times. Cultures in their prime, when they're in carrying capacity surplus and they've reached their peak in terms of wealth and progress and power and everything else, typically, usually a half a century to 2 centuries later, the population is 90% less than it was at the peak. We've seen that happen dozens of times. And so it seems to me that we will see, through drought, famine, war, and living in a post-antibiotic age, I can't imagine there's going to be less than a billion people or less than half a billion people, even 50 years from now.
So someone asked, how long do you think humanity will survive? And what are your estimates? How do you think it's going to end? Just your speculations.
Yeah. I don't know, obviously. I think that given the fact that abrupt climate change seems to be genuinely out of our control, and that there's a thing called the blue ocean event, the BOE. This Paul Beckwith talks about this a lot, as does meteorologist Nick Humphrey. But that as there was less and less ice in the Arctic, and all of this heat and energy that was being reflected is now absorbed into the dark blue ocean, releasing more methane, releasing more heat, releasing more methane. This positive we call it positive, but self-reinforcing feedback of Arctic methane and nitrous oxide in the Arctic specifically could wig out so severely that we could see 4, 5 or more degrees Celsius rise in average global temperature, and some regions, of course, being a lot worse than that. We could see that happen in a decade. We could see that happen in 15 years. If that happens, it would be totally a faith claim to assume that humans will survive 4 degrees Celsius rise in temperature. There might be. The vision that excites me is that we don't go extinct this century, that there are, 0.1% of humanity survives. That's 1 in 1,000 people. That's basically 7 or 8 million people surviving in pockets in different isolated, disparate places around the planet, and surviving for another 1 million or 2 million years before an asteroid or supervolcano or something takes us out. Well, that knows, but I'm at peace with my mortality. I'm living this year as if this could be my last, not just because of coronavirus, but that's just a useful way for me to live. I love my life when I live it that way, when I treat it as if it could be my last. And I'm treating this decade as if it could be humanity's last. Do I think it's going to be? No, not really. I think there's a better than 95% chance that at least some of us will survive this decade and the next. But whether we survive another 20 years or whether we survive another 2 million years, it's probably going to be in that window. And then life goes on. Species come and go, the earth turns, everything happens. So my faith, to come back to the religious naturalist thing, my faith is in evolution. My faith is in ecology. My trust is in the large scale processes of the living world of which we're a part and upon which we depend utterly.
Justin Maurer said before you mentioned feudalism, it was one of the kinds of societies that lives self-sustainably or more self-sustainably. Do you endorse
Well, yeah,
feudalism,
to
or
say that it's just, yeah, no, good question. But again, I'm out of my league in talking about it. What I do know is that we find barter, we find ways of dealing with exchanging and mutual obligation and a sense of indebtedness and whatever in non-market based economies. And how that will play out in terms of our future, I've got no idea. And I'm not an expert on how it's played out in China over the various dynasties, or in Egypt or Maya or Aztec. I mean, it's just literally an area I've not researched. So I can't really say. But what I do know is that whatever local scale you can do now to bring some of the economic activity into the households. So we start seeing household economics again, where we start trading with our neighbors. We start being concerned and committed to the well-being of the people within a 2-block, 3-block radius of ourselves. Obviously, this isn't practical in some cities, but nonetheless, what I'm suggesting to people is a great way to live, no matter how scary or difficult or challenging in these contracting times. Get to know your neighbors. Have the best possible relationship with your family, your blood family that you can. The people who you used to be close to, apologize for being a jerk and get close to them again. I mean, there are proven ways of coming back into a good relationship with people that you used to be close to, but now you're not. It's not a difficult thing to do. So having the best possible relationship with family, friends, neighbors, is, I think, going to be a really healthy, soul nourishing, to use religious language, thing to do in these very challenging times in which we live.
Well, one question is that the societies that do live more sustainably, like for example the Native Americans, always seem to be taken over and conquered by the techno societies. And so it seems like if we adopt those kinds of more sustainable societies, it puts us at risk of being subjected by the Chinas and Russias who don't really care. Do you think that's kind of a big problem for adopting that worldview?
Oh, it's absolutely huge. First of all, that's totally accurate. There was a book that was written, Schmuckler, the Parable of the Tribes, that the idea that once you start mining metals and creating weapons and tools, where it's possible to take over another place and use their resources, wipe out their people, whatever, you're kind of in an arms race that yeah, it's one of the reasons why one of my favorite writers, in addition to Teddy Goldsmith, the other writer on sustainability that I just adore, is Richard Adrian Reese has a website called, a blog called What is Sustainable? And he's got, he's reviewed over 200 of the best books on genuine sustainability. And he said, yeah, the bastards always win, meaning that at least in the last 7,000 years, you've got these cultures that will overpower and dominate. If they've got the technology to do it, and you've got enough, sociopaths or psychopaths in leadership, or just power hungry people, once you've got power, political power, that, yeah, it tends to dominate. And so, yeah, I'm not exactly hopeful. In fact, I could say confidently that I don't think that we're going to choose voluntarily to come into deep ecological balance with the living world. I think we are going to experience the consequences of out of right relationship to reality. And then hopefully these pockets of humanity, wherever they are, we will not have fossil fuels to travel across the world again. So I think we'll never see globalization again. And it's possible that we'll be so fragmented that basically that will eliminate the parable of the tribes thing, simply because so much of the world will not be habitable.
Ivo Andre asked, do you think we'll be able to colonize other planets and move to like Mars?
I don't. I honestly don't. I think that's Elon Musk's wet dream, and that's cool. But no. I mean, we would have an easier job colonizing Antarctica. That's still on this planet, but the idea, just solar radiation will keep us. We'll send robots to Mars, no question. We've been doing that. But mammalian bodies, primate mammalian bodies, will not survive the onslaught of cosmic radiation. So no, I don't see that ever happening.
Justin Maurer asked, where, when our ancestors passed down conflicting wisdom, how do we go about determining which one is right? Or more specifically, how do we determine what is the correct way to live sustainably?
Well, that's a great question, and it can only be answered in experience. I mean, if you have, let's say, okay, you're an oral culture, or even say you've got literacy, and you have conflicting, ideas. How to live sustainably, that is, how to live in a way that doesn't diminish and degrade everything you depend upon, is going to be different in different regions of the world. So living in the desert, or living in the tundra, or living in mountains, or wherever we live, we're going to have to do that. And the climate is changing so rapidly, the growing zones are changing so rapidly, that what was successful in the past may not be successful in the future. My wife Connie, she actually is, she thinks there's a much better chance that our species will go extinct this century than will survive this century. But she's committed to the trees. Whether we go extinct this century or not, she's committed to doing everything she possibly can to further, it's called assisted migration. There's a whole field called assisted migration, assisting trees in migrating, because no animal can move their seeds now that the passenger pigeon we've eradicated. No animal can move its seeds fast enough. So humans, the difference between thousands of species of shrubs, plants, and native trees going extinct this century, and those same, let's not say thousands, the difference between hundreds of species of native trees and plants going extinct this century, and those same 100 species of plants and trees surviving this century, will depend on one thing, which is humans assisting them in migrating, getting seeds from a few hundred miles south that are already warm adapted, and then planting them a few hundred miles north. So it's this field of assisted migration. And there's a major book, Zach St. George, who's an award-winning journalist, just wrote a book coming out next month with Norton Publications, and it's called The Journeys of Trees. And it's all about this field of assisted migration. It actually features my wife Connie from the very first sentence throughout the book. So it's
yeah, that's also a really interesting topic, because I know the trees also have their own COVID kind of a thing, where they're all dying from a certain kind of disease that's affecting trees all over North America and some places in Asia too.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. Gail Zawecki, I think is her name, writes about that in terms of ozone. And then you've got climate. The other thing is that you've got a situation where beetles used to be killed because they used to have enough cold. And now it doesn't get cold enough in certain regions. So you've got the massive bark beetles situation. And yeah, we are likely to be in the early stages of the great conflagration, which is where trees all over the world, not all kinds of trees and not everywhere, but where much of the world's forests burn, which of course will add to the carbon and the methane.
Yeah. Iron Charioteer asks, do you think humans should be sovereign beings, or do you think it's better that we are subjugated by like a ruling force, like a governments or gods, or those kinds of being accountable to system things?
Yeah, I'm not even sure I quite know how to address that question. I mean, we just are what we are. I mean, yeah, I don't think we
like it would be better if we're in these systems with governments who give us these kinds of accountability ideologies, or is it better
governments become so corrupt so quickly. Once you start having city-based, grain-based civilizations, there's two books written with the same title, Against the Grain. One written by James Scott, I forget. And then the other one written by Richard Manning. And they're both about the history of agricultural-based civilizations and how devastating agricultural-based civilizations are to the living world upon which we depend. Rick Reese covers that in his book. He's actually got a free book. He's now on sample 42, I think it is. He writes like every other week, every 2 weeks, he adds another sample. It's like a half a chapter, but on his blog, and the title of the book is Wild, Free, and Happy. And I've been so impressed with this book and process, Wild, Free, and Happy, that I recorded all, I'm up to 40, the 42nd segment. But he also talks about the how quickly governments become corrupt. And so, yeah, I'm probably more on the anarchist side of things, in that I think state government is the problem. not usually the solution, but we are wherever we find ourselves. It's not, wherever anybody's watching or listening to this from, that's the government you currently live in. That's the region, the bioregion you currently live in. And then the question becomes how to live as adaptively and as healthfully as you can, given the cultural, biophysical, and other constraints and limits upon your life where you are. And now with COVID and everything else, we're living in a really strange and interesting world.
Yeah, before you mentioned good and bad religions, like the good ones being the ones that teach us to live in harmony with nature, like animism. Do you think that all of the anthropomorphic religions that see a kind of supernatural deity kind of things would be in the bad religion category?
Well, I didn't mean good and bad in a narrow or too narrow sense. What I meant is there's healthy religion, that is religion. Let's put it this way. If religion doesn't do the three functions that I mentioned, and again, this is standard religious naturalism. Loyal Rue wrote about this in a number of his books. He's a leading religious naturalist, Loyal, R-U-E. But personal wholeness, social coherence, and ecological integrity. Turns out most of the great religions, the great religions of the last 2,500 years, the Axial Age, are pretty good at personal wholeness and social coherence, and they suck at ecological integrity. And so that's why I'm in favor. Again, that's why I wear a green clergy shirt when I speak in churches of all kinds, is that I am committed to religion having a born again experience. That is religion repenting of its anthropocentrism, its human centeredness, and coming back to the biosphere as a greater thou, not a lesser it. And so religions that do that, religions that integrate ecological wisdom, I think are on the healthy edge, and those have some sense of possibly surviving this bottleneck. And religions that are still all about supernaturalism and otherworldlyism and are actually disparaging and lead us to live in ways that are harmful to the soil, water, forest, life upon which we depend, those religions will be rejected by our children and grandchildren, should those children and grandchildren even exist. That's why I say any theology that doesn't include ecology at the heart of it within 50 years will be completely rejected by our grandkids.
And what do you think about?
Must be the heart of theology.
Oh yeah. So what do you think about uploading our consciousness to computers and things? Is that something you're for, against, ambivalent?
Ambivalent. It's not about. I mean, it's going to happen. Whether we're going to try it, there will be, the Ray Kurzweils of the world and others. Will try it. But ultimately, again, anything that doesn't live in integrity with the biosphere is not going to be sustainable over the long run. So,
well, yeah, that was kind of my question.
We're embedded consciousnesses. For me, the idea that my consciousness is somehow separate from my biology, I just don't even know how to make sense of. So, I'm definitely not of the Ray Kurzweil. That vision of humans uploading our consciousness to machines and computers and stuff. If it does it for you, great, but it's not my worldview.
Would that fit into your definition of living in harmony with the ecology? Say we could absolutely do that and then just live off of solar powered panels or something. Would that count as being?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I honestly don't know. I mean, I've watched the Matrix trilogy dozens of times. I like it, but who knows? Again, it's not my. It's not my field of. I've not studied it deeply. I certainly have no passion or enthusiasm for it. I don't invest my time and energy in learning more about it, and I certainly that vision of the future doesn't offer me anything positive. But it's not like I'm opposed to it and trying to stop it or whatever either. It's
Yeah, I definitely think it's interesting. I hope for it, because I think that if we could live in those kinds of worlds where we could just I'd like a cup of coffee, then snap your fingers, cup of coffee. It'd be great. It'd be awesome.
Yeah, I think that's there's a book, I forget the guy's name, Kurt Anderson maybe, called Fantasyland. 500 years of how America went haywire. Our thinking from the founding of this country has been so based on wishful thinking and illusions and denial of reality. Do you know Rob Malkarski?
Mm-mm.
He's got an Undenial website. Oh, you and he'd get along. He's he's also brilliant, and he's got his website is undenial.com is what I think it is.
What is he? What is his specialty?
Oh, he's all about limits, and he gets the ecological worldview, but he's brilliant. He's like you. I mean, he thinks he's probably on the spectrum somewhere, high functioning autistic or Asperger or whatever. But he integrates a lot of stuff. He's sort of a bulldog for Varkey on his denial, his book Denial. But he's very much about
Varkey. What is Varkey?
Well, there's a book called Denial by a scientist, Ajit, Ajait, I think, Ajit Varkey, Varki. And he wrote a book. Danny Brower died, and they were in communication, and he basically furthered Danny Brower's. So the book is Denial, and it's very popular among a lot of science-oriented people. I think where you and Rob would probably differ fairly significantly, I think, is on sort of, I think you're more techno-optimist, and I think he's less that. But in any case, he's a brilliant guy. He's got a great blog and is contributing in some really helpful and interesting ways.
Awesome. I'll check that out. I'll definitely also check out John Michael Greer, because you mentioned some things about him. Did you mention them on stream, or that was all before, right?
Yeah, the books of John Michael Greer's that I love the most, that I've all recorded. If you just Google John Michael Greer and Michael Dowd on SoundCloud, you'll see I've created a number of SoundCloud where I've gotten his permission and the author's permission and the publisher's permission. So the Long Descent is fabulous. The Ecotechnic Future is fabulous. The Wealth of Nature is fabulous. Decline and Fall, The End of Empire and the Future of Democracy in 21st Century America. That's awesome. I was so impressed with his book, Dark Age America, which is about, he's saying, if abrupt climate change doesn't do us in, that this is a vision of what's likely in the next 500 years here in North America, given what we know about history. And again, he's one of the world's experts on the rise and fall of civilization. So if the politics unwinds in the ways they typically do, if the economy unwinds in the ways that it typically does, the senility of the elites happens in the way that it typically does, here's what and if the ecology unravels in the ways that we see in paleoclimate data and understanding from historical evidence of how civilizations commit ecocide, then here's what's likely in the next 500 years in North America. And it's a surprisingly inspiring vision of a life in North America in the next 500 years. It's called Dark Age America. So I was the official audio narrator for that. But yeah, I like John Michael Greer. I like Teddy Goldsmith, The Way. I love William Ophuls, this little book, Why Civilizations Fall, Immoderate Greatness, Why Civilizations Fall by William Ophuls. He's probably the leading person who brings the ecological worldview to politics and governance. So how do we govern ourselves? What does politics even look like if it mirrors ecological wisdom? So Immoderate Greatness is a great one.
And we had a question. Stephen Tilley asked what were the other names of the other books about the agricultural societies you mentioned and the...
Oh, yeah. Against the Grain is the name of the book. James Scott, I think it's James Scott, is the author of one of them, and the other is Richard Manning.
And the one about the going downhill, the society's collapsing one?
Oh, that was in the BBC where I cover and I mentioned the different resources is my 24-minute Pinker takedown video called Sane versus Insane Progress. So that's up on YouTube. It's Sane versus Insane Progress. And I talk about that. Luke Kemp wrote a piece for the BBC called Are We on the Road to Civilizational Collapse? And he has the charts with all the different civilizations and stuff. But this little book here, Apologies to the Grandchildren by William Ophuls, the subtitle, Reflections on Our Ecological Predicament, Its Deeper Causes, and Its Political Consequences. So he writes these little things. He's also well known for stuff that he wrote decades ago. But these, William Catton, his book Overshoot, The Ecological Basis, the single most important book I've ever read in my life. William Ophuls, Teddy Goldsmith, John Michael Greer. Yeah, these are some of my favorite authors.
Oh yeah, thanks. Because some people were asking about the names of the books.
Sure.
There's also a question like, do you think that ecotheism and techno-positivism are at odds? Like, for example, Denmark is like 72% renewable energy. Is it possible to be both technologically advanced and not ecotheism or anti-ecotheism?
Yeah, that's a great question. I've shifted myself on that question in that Thomas Berry was one of my great mentors. He was one of the more significant ecological and evolutionary thinkers of the 20th century. And so I was introduced to his work in 1988. And so ecology became my theology pretty much in 1988. But from 2000 to 2012 to December 2012, I became very much of a techno-optimist, and I believe that technology and humans becoming ever more symbiotic with our technology could actually help us live in a way that was ecologically wise and sane. And I only lost that on December 3rd of 2012. I watched a TED Talk called Climate Change is Simple by David Roberts. Climate Change is Simple, a little 14, 15-minute TEDx talk. And I watched that and I started crying. I woke Connie up. We both watched it. We were both crying. And my techno-optimism pretty much died that day. And then I've spent 20, 30, sometimes 40 hours a week over the last 7 years studying the rise and fall of civilizations and all of this. All of my audio recordings, I've recorded like 1,000 hours of the best, what I consider deep sustainability scripture. And by scripture, I simply mean the most inspired stuff I become aware of and that other people tell me about. And it's all up on SoundCloud. Grace Limits. If you just put Grace Limits, Michael Dowd or Michael Dowd Grace Limits, you get my playlists. And I have all of the best authors, including all the ones I've talked about here and stuff, because and they're all freely available. I do this because I re-listen to these books, like Catton's Overshoot. I've re-listened to this a dozen times because it's so kick-ass and it's so inspiring and so helpful that I just about every 6 months I listen to my audio narration. And the nice thing about recording the unofficial audio of all these books, and I get compliments on this all the time, is that at the end of a really great paragraph, I'll say, now that paragraph was so good, I'm going to read it again. So it alerts the audio listener, hey, get out of your trance, listen to this. And I've had dozens and dozens of people tell me that they really appreciate that.
That's actually a really interesting idea. I never thought about that before because I'm doing an audiobook too for one of my books. So.
Oh, sweet. Yeah.
So anyway,
well, the other thing is that when I'm moved to tears, I mean, I stumble, I mispronounce words. So it's not a professional recording in the sense that it's not like professionally done, but there's a hominess to it. And sometimes you'll hear Connie on the couch, correcting my pronunciation of a word and whatever. But by repeating good paragraphs and by letting my emotions show, when I'm moved by somebody's, like Catton's generosity of soul, toward the end of chapter 7, man, I'm in a full-blown, I am so moved by his generosity of soul that I've had people tell me that they were driving down Interstate 70. They were listening to my audio recording of it. They could hear my voice starting to crack. Their own eyes started filling with moisture. And this one guy said, a very famous atheist preacher, pull off the side of the road. And he says, I was bawling at the end of that. I couldn't even drive, so. At any rate, I have fun. I have fun recording these.
Yeah. Well, we've been going for a little bit over an hour now. I really appreciate you coming on. It was a lot of fun talking to you. Thanks for all the references. They're really interesting to look into.
Well, Tom, I appreciate you and the way you have a gentle way of being that even when you're challenging in terms of intellectually, there's a respectful, gentle way of being. So I wish you the best in this project of yours.
Thanks. Thanks again for coming on. I'll talk to you later.
Cool, great. And yeah, people should check out the Post-Doom Conversations. That's my best body of work now, postdoom.com.
Definitely. I'll put a link in the description actually for them.
Okay, sweet. Thanks, Tom.
Yep. Talk to you later. Bye.
Bye-bye.
This episode of the TJump podcast is brought to you by you. If you value this content, please consider supporting the channel.